Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, July the 21st, the penultimate day of the parliamentary term, although Keir Starmer will only be taking a brief break this year, we are told. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And my name is Sam Coates of Sky News. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's. MPs, apart from ministers, disappear from Westminster tomorrow for recess. The Prime Minister will spend much of the next 6 weeks planning what he's going to do over the autumn, but not planning, we are told, a reshuffle. Now, the Times said he was looking at mixing up his more junior ministerial ranks over the weekend, although not his cabinet level team. But this morning, I am being told that even saying that is daft. Even that he is contemplating a mix-up at below cabinet level isn't true.
Well, that's decisive. I suppose the question is, why not? There was talk of a reshuffle also inside Downing Street, with one veteran of the Blair era potentially poised for a very high-profile return. That's Tim Allen, who was one of Tony Blair's closest aides, both in opposition and then in Downing Street in the early Blair period. He's gone on to a very successful career in business and communications, and he is slated, Sam, to return as permanent secretary, so the highest civil servant grade for communications all across government. That really would shake up that particular pack if it comes to pass.
Well, that's fascinating. We will see whether that comes to plans. I can only tell you that there are no plans for a reshuffle in September, to use our favoured formulation. So circle that promise with a highlighter, and someone at some point will be eating a hat if it's not true. Instead, the PM will be using his summer to focus on Labour conference and the budget. That's what I'm going to spend a large chunk of the next 6 weeks dreaming about too, Anne.
We will miss your morning shot of wit there, Sam, and we will be in separate places but having the same dreams for what awaits us in the autumn. I think we're now so synced together by this podcast. So a reminder, tomorrow may be our last daily episode, but we do live on over the summer. Every week we will have a deep dive into a different subject: health, education, foreign affairs, the economy. You might call it your summer box set. You can either binge it just before you come back to work in September to make sure you're up to date for the term ahead in British politics, or you can listen one at a time and let us know what you think. We've got Ed Conway joining us on the economy and Politico's editor-in-chief, John Harris, on the world. And they'll stop dropping from next Monday. Just before we go on, though, Sam, you're not in your usual berth, or should I say nest?
Yes, sorry, it's a little bit more frantic than normal this morning. Slightly less prep and slightly more trouble reading into the regulation of the water industry, because it turned out that there is a mouse in the kitchen and a standoff with Bob the cat. And if there is one thing I cannot stand, and it is mice. In every relationship, you divide up some of the big tasks, and dealing with mice is definitely in the purview of my wife. So I have run away to a different room, which is where I'm doing the podcast from. Anyway, there's an awful lot going on this week to distract me from what on earth is going on downstairs.
You're not standing on a chair, are you? Like in Tom and Jerry.
I mean, honestly, that is a bit the vibe. I'm brave in many ways, but not when it comes to that. There's a lot going on this week to distract me from what's going on downstairs. We have got two world leaders coming to the UK. Indian Premier Narendra Modi will be the first. He will meet Keir Starmer and the King as part of a flying visit to sign that free trade agreement that we heard about in May.
Then at the weekend, the Prime Minister will meet President Trump, who is visiting his two golf courses in Ayrshire and in Aberdeenshire from Friday. Now, this is part of a working visit, so the PM is expected to also discuss the outstanding tariffs on UK steel and try to resolve the fact that they remain excluded from a wider trade deal affecting car makers and aerospace firms primarily. There were reports last week that Starmer might just be able to get these down to zero, but that is a high expectation. We just have to hope that the US president has a couple of really good rounds before he meets Britain's Prime Minister.
I wonder whether Keir Starmer's been practicing his swing. I know that I was talking to a very high-profile political journalist who was wondering whether holding aloft their golf caddy might be the way of getting a question from the US president. Another thing on the agenda will be Ukraine. Today, John Healey, the defense secretary, will call for a 50-day drive to arm Ukraine when he chairs a meeting of Kyiv's allies. But in that context, obviously, what the US thinks remains absolutely key. And I was very struck, actually, at a piece at the weekend by the longtime government advisor and professor of history and foreign policy at King's College London, a guy called John Bew. He's well known within the Westminster Village for advising successive governments. And he wrote a piece in the Sunday Times about policy towards Ukraine. And he said, take the interesting case of America's First Lady in shaping Donald Trump's changing approach to Ukraine. For months, people had speculated whether Trump would realise Putin had no interest in peace talks and was simply stringing him along. But as he told it last week, the realization eventually came in a matter-of-fact way when he talked to Melania, who pointed out that Putin was seemingly constructive on the phone, but simultaneously dropping ever more ordnance on civilian areas in Ukraine. I had put a lot of credit down to Jonathan Powell. I think I probably still do, the Prime Minister's national security advisor, for just helping nudge America to the right place on this. And what did you make of that intervention by a First Lady that we don't often hear of when it comes to Trump and foreign policy and how he should think about President Putin?
I thought it was really an interesting insight there from John Bew, who, as you point out, Sam, is a serious player. He knows what happens in one place that leads to a decision in another, etc. And he's sort of seen the workings of that relationship close up. And I think he's fundamentally right. And I've always thought it was a mistake, because sometimes people who are just irritated by Donald Trump and his world is slightly mysterious to say, oh, this is really just a sham marriage, or Melania doesn't play much of a role. Look how sour she's looking. Now, she may have her off days, as first ladies can do, and it may be a complex relationship, but nonetheless, Donald Trump is someone who takes in information and likes to make decisions, I think, in a sort of verbal way. I think he enjoys conversation. And someone I spoke to who'd been in his inner team said that there was, if you like, a bit of method in his madness on that. He's not a big reader of documents. I think you can probably imagine that, but that he liked to hear views very pro, let's say, on arming Ukraine, very pro, very con, and really have them fight it out. And often to the point of bitterness and tension in his circle, and then have one clinching conversation which will move in one way or the other. The suggestion here is that Melania played that role by simply pointing out that, yes, you're having these conversations with Putin and they're not getting anywhere, but yeah, look what I'm looking at on the television screens or wherever she's seeing the information about the bombardment of civilians in Ukraine. These two things don't really go together. You're being strung along, and that may have just played that crystallizing role. It certainly also fits with the conversations that we know Donald Trump had with Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, about that time, that he initially didn't want to take the offer of German help on weapons, and then about 2 weeks later he did. So something changed, and that's a possible explanation.
Anyway, onto water. There's an overhaul being announced today. I confess, Anne, in between the mice rustling, I typed the words massive overhaul this morning, but I actually deleted the word massive because, and I know that they're not going to like this, but it's not totally clear to me that it is. But what I do want to do, and I know you do too, is just spend a bit of time on this. Don't kill us, listener, for spending a bit of time on water regulation, because in many ways, what's going on in the water sector really, really typifies the challenge that this government has in so many different areas, whether it's on delivery or how they're delivering or how they're communicating. Just spending a bit of time looking at this one area as a really good petri dish of how Keir Starmer's government works it is useful. Now, what's going on is that the government has rather impressively found an awful lot of ways of telling pretty much the same story ever since your colleague kind of got the jump on this on Friday and scooped them with the sort of top line announcement of what is happening today. So do you want to take it away about what's happening and what's been going on since Friday?
Well, yes, indeed. Dan Bloom for Politico got that scoop, the report by the former Bank of England Deputy Governor John Cunliffe, recommending that the water regulator Ofwat be scrapped altogether. And the question now is what replaces it and how that affects this notoriously messy regulation of an industry, which, just to remind ourselves, isn't just a network of privatized water companies, which people often take a view on, pro or con, but that these are themselves, in many cases, debt laden, and they are afloat on these big piles of lending through private equity and through pension companies who are supporting the privatized entities. And they are much harder to regulate. They have a habit of coming and going. We've seen a few of them come in and out of the market in the UK, or sign up to things and then sign back out of them. So the Reed reforms, named after Steve Reed, the lucky Environment Secretary who gets his name on this, are targeting a big reset. You might be right to be skeptical about the word massive. We should probably usually take that out of our scripts, but it's intended to be sizable, I would say. Let's see what you think about this, Sam. First of all, you've got a reset there, at least signalling getting tough on polluting water bosses, possible jail sentences for those who don't act, etc. Count the money on that one if and when it happens. Concrete recommendation that Southern Water's chief executive should refuse a pay rise that has almost doubled his income. That's pretty direct intervention there by the Environment Secretary in the sector, and intended to send a message. The water companies tend to say that however we may be thinking about the amount of sewage going up into the sea near me in Kent at the weekends, that these guys are doing a great job, and that they need to recruit and they need to pay. So that would be quite an interesting standoff. Then you get to the big meat of the announcement, which is a rebuild over 10 years, a pledge to cut sewage emissions in half over 5. That will be quite difficult to deliver. But then over 10 years, you would have what Steve Reed is calling this rebuild, with massive private sector investment coming in, over 100 billion to rebuild from the bottom up and overhaul that infrastructure of pipes and networks and all the bits that have basically just not working anymore. But that, as I say, is on top of this rather shaky water company infrastructure. What do you reckon?
Well, can I just kick off by saying how much I love they're called the Reed reforms. We didn't get the Streeting strategy or the Reeves revolution, but we do have the Reed reform. And as you set out there, what is impressive is that the government has given a lot of thinking about how it frames this, how it tells us this story. There's a political dimension that voters, both who are left-leaning, green-leaning, and reform right-leaning, who like community and have pride in their natural environment, are attracted to this kind of policy, as well as why, in policy terms, it's the right thing to do. So it's more thought through from the DEFRA team than I can remember an announcement being before. That be it said, at the centerpiece of today's announcement is a decision to move some civil servants around, right? To rebadge one group of civil servants working in one bit, and rather like a jigsaw, sort of push together different teams in order to make the whole system better. It's too early from my point of view whether or not that is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. It always comes at a cost. How much does that cost? We don't know that at the moment. But I want to boil down to 3 questions that I think underpin today, and then one sort of bit more big picture philosophical point, right? And I want you to give your verdict after each of the 3 questions, Anne. So question number 1 from me: what happens to bills? Right. The promise that you're going to hear about today is that this government will ensure that you never see bill rises on the same scale as last year. Now, at the turn of the year, it turned out that bills last year were going up from last year, were going up 26%. So the promise is we will never have bill rises of over 26% in a year. Now, 2 things about that. First of all, 26% is a lot. It is not particularly a stretching target, and so, I'm not sure just how good that sounds when you boil it down. But also, Anne, as you will know, as an expert in water regulation, bills have actually been set for the next 5 years until 2030. So there aren't going to be any price changes at all. They're going to go up by an average over the 5 years of 36%. So that's when you average it out, that's obviously a lot less than 26% in a year. But the promise on price, I think, well, ultimately issues to do with price have already been determined. So I'm not sure that's a big deal today.
Well, on the bills, yes, it is not as much of a rise, thankfully, as it was in the last year, but that's still quite a lot over 5 years. You're still getting money in, and that's the intention of that. And by putting it over the 5 years, as you point out, one, it takes us beyond the next election, which is kind of useful. And secondly, it does get some money in through the door, which they desperately need in order to feed through to these reforms.
So the second big thing is whether or not the sewers are actually going to be fundamentally rebuilt by the time, within a meaningful time period. Um, and we are told, that we haven't built a reservoir for 30 years. And in fact, what's really been going on, Anne, is that in this hyper-regulated sector, bills haven't been going up enough in the last few years because they've been leaned on by government, not least because of the cost of living crisis. And that's one of the causes of the problem, along with these companies that we'll come to in a second. But the question is, can there be a massive rebuilding exercise in the next few years? The pledge from government is to rebuild some of the network, the pipes and the sewers in this parliament, but not all of it. That's a 10-year strategy. And it does help the government to have 10-year strategies because it just means that the judgment time is outside of one election cycle.
Exactly. And even 10 years is relatively short time to get this done, albeit they have managed to get this commitments to over 100 billion of investment there from the companies. But that all assumes that the companies will stay active and are still in the market and that their own situation works out. So it all works in theory. And it does work over 10 years. Yes, I think they will find it very difficult to hit that halving the sewage target in 5 years unless they start to play around with definitions and say like it was okay for half of the day. But weirdly enough, the sewage spill only counted because it happened in the afternoon.
The third question I've got is there retribution that satisfies the public, but also what's the impact of that retribution? And is there another side of the coin? Does it basically ultimately end up harming this government's ambitions on growth? So one of the things that this government boasted about was taking away bonuses. But I have to say, Anne, that means that there was no action on salaries. And as we know from the banking sector, if you increase bonuses, if you cap bonuses, then you end up often having shareholders and directors increasing base pay instead. It's just one of the things that the market does. And that's, I think, what's gone on in the Southern Water case. And here we're left with the Environment Secretary just looking weak, just begging the head of Southern Water not to take his base pay, which he is legally entitled to do. So I'm not sure about that. There are 81 live criminal investigations, the government tells me, by the Environment Agency that haven't concluded, which could result in people going to jail. We don't know very much about them. Investigations happen in secret. Obviously, we'll only find out more when it gets to court. But here's the big picture thing. The private sector runs the water industry, but it is incredibly heavily regulated. And essentially, it's all owned by private equity pretty much now. Moody's has downgraded the water sector because of all of the interference by government. You've got massive investors like KKR walking away because of their nerves about what's going on. And in the end, you're promising lower bonuses, higher fines, greater regulation. You're imploring people not to take their salaries and very, very direct outcomes. The question is, does the level of government interference in water actually work as a model? And does it actually deter investors from other utilities? Is there a bigger knock-on, a sort of a problem that this causes for growth overall?
The funny thing about that is you'd think it would, wouldn't you? And then certainly in the case of KKR, who sort of came in briefly or said they were coming in and then went out again. There was a massive private equity and investment entity. But others are not deterred. And if you actually look around the nerdy financial investment press, around the world, water and getting involved with water is seen as a good long-term bet on the ground, Sam, that governments can, if you like, mess about with regulation and squeeze for a while, but then ultimately there is water shortage. We're massively short of water across the developed world, let alone beyond. And actually, it's seen as quite a good bet. But the terms, and here's where you're right, where people want to come in is that they're not going to have their chief executives if his bonus gets reduced in order to make a good headline. then somehow the money will come in on the package in a different way, one way or the other. These people want to be paid at the market rate. And I think that is a classic tension we've often talked about on this podcast, also for Rachel Reeves and her bigger picture about, do you want this inward investment or don't you? Or do you want it but only on sort of very laboury kind of terms? I do think in the water sector, I do understand why people are furious with these companies. Just trying to point out, there is a business model here. And unless you're going to fully nationalise it, which they're not, then this is going to continue to be a headache.
Ending pollution, lower bills and biggest ever fines feels like a problematic sell to the global investment market. I'm very interested to hear that you think there are signs of optimism.
Well, they just keep coming back. That's just interesting, isn't it? Macquarie, the big Australian finance company, is back in again. So they seem to, you could say they think in the end that they've got the upper hand.
Now, if that doesn't feel like we quite know where it's going, spare a thought for Belgium. Anne, why is that?
You should always spare a thought for Belgium, which I do because we have Politico, very good office there. So I find out from my colleagues about what's going on. It is National Day in Belgium. And that is a big deal. And the King and everyone else is out there celebrating. And we used it as a hook for a deep dive on the fact that it hasn't had a government, and then now we're going to like a full second year without a government in Belgium. Every attempt to create one breaks down. It's a well-known story of those sort of internally kind of vociferous inability to get maybe the two constituent big political parts of Belgium together under a government. And an ultimatum was given that they should have one perhaps before this second National Day without a government, and that didn't come to pass either. A lot of it feels a bit like what we see in the rest of the world. Frankly, you've got a Socialist Party that won't accept dealing with the hard or even further right. Whatever the reasons, for those interested in Belgian politics, get in touch with me directly or with Nick Vinegar, our great correspondent. Whatever the reason, it's not happening. And so they came to a really interesting decision, Sam. They should go away on holiday for the summer and then think about it again when they get back.
Having a holiday helps everything just clarify. And I'm sure that's something that they feel in this number 10 as well. On which note, we have bussed over our cap, our limit, our 20-minute limit. So we ought to wind it up there. With dread, I'm going to tiptoe downstairs and see what's happening in the war zone of our kitchen. And I will report back tomorrow for Tuesday's Politics at Sam and Anne's. I will see you then.
There'll be a very smug-looking cat in the background, like in sort of James Bond, won't there?
Hopefully. See you tomorrow.
See you then.